Don't. The man froze mid-stride, hands halfway to his rifle, and something in Cora Ashfield's voice told him exactly how close he'd come to dying in the dark. 12 men had ridden onto her mountain that morning. Armed, trained, confident. They didn't know this ground. She did. The first shot came before dawn, not aimed at flesh, but at iron, splintering a wagon axle into the frozen silence like a warning shot fired straight from the past. Because 5 years ago, they'd killed her husband and called it an accident. Because they'd cut her fences, salted her land with blood, and believed a widow alone wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, 2 wagons lay broken. 12 armed men were pinned behind rocks that gave them no cover at all. And somewhere below, watching through cold morning light, a man realized too late exactly whose mountain he'd just invaded. They didn't just call her the widow. They called her the ghost. The frost came first. Before the light. Before the birds. It came the way it always came in the high country, silent, patient, laying itself over the ground like something that had been waiting all night for permission. Cora Ashfield knelt beside the tracks and did not move for a long time. 4 sets of prints, deep, heavy, pressed into ground that had no business being crossed by anyone who didn't know this mountain the way she was still learning to know it. She peeled off one glove with her teeth and touched the edge of the nearest print. Cold, but not frozen through, which meant hours, not days, which meant close. She straightened, slow, the way her knees demanded lately, and looked east toward the tree line where the prints disappeared into shadow. Her breath came out in a long gray ribbon, and hung there a second before the wind took it. Someone had walked her land in the dark, someone who knew exactly where to step. She was 38 years old. Some mornings she felt it in her spine like a debt coming due. This was one of those mornings. The cold did that. Made her feel every year she'd spent doing things a woman her age wasn't supposed to have done. Made her feel every year since. 5 years, actually. Since Nathaniel. She pushed the thought down the way she'd learned to. Not gone. Just filed. A drawer she kept shut until she needed what was inside it. Right now she needed her eyes. The tracks led toward the restricted section, the deep hollow where the creek never froze, where the elk came down at dusk to drink, where she'd told herself, out loud, standing on this exact ridge 6 months ago, nothing human is going to touch this ground again. Something human had touched it last night. She followed the prints 20 yards before she found the first wrong thing. The wire. She'd strung it herself, 3 weeks back. Gut line, thin as a thought, threaded across the game trail at ankle height, with 3 brass bells tied along its length. Cheap thing. Old-fashioned thing. The kind of alarm a woman alone on 2,000 acres rigs up because she can't be everywhere at once and she needs the mountain to talk to her when she's asleep. The wire was cut. Not snapped, not torn loose by a startled buck. Cut. Clean. A single motion. Blade drawn tight and fast. The kind of cut that came from a hand that had done it before and would do it again without thinking twice. Cora knelt and turned the severed end between 2 fingers. Professional. The word arrived in her chest before it arrived in her mind, and once it landed it wouldn't leave. She felt something cold uncoil low in her stomach. Not fear. She'd buried fear a long time ago, out past Santa Fe, out past the badge, out past the boy in the alley whose face still showed up some nights uninvited. This wasn't fear. This was recognition. She knew this feeling. She'd felt it exactly twice before in her life. Once the morning she found the outlaw camp outside Trinidad and realized the men inside it weren't drunk cattle rustlers. They were something colder, something organized. And once, 5 years ago, kneeling on a ridge with her husband's blood soaking through the knees of her dress, understanding too late, always too late, that his death had not been an accident at all. Because accidents didn't cut wire clean. Because accidents didn't know where the trip lines were strung in the first place. She stood. Rifle came off her shoulder without her telling her arm to do it. Old habit. The sharps had been Nathaniel's. She'd kept it the way some a wedding ring in a drawer they never opened. Not because she needed the reminder, but because letting it go felt like letting him go, and she wasn't ready. Might never be ready. Didn't matter. The rifle came off her shoulder and settled into her hands like it remembered her. The tracks kept moving east. Confident, unhurried, she followed them. Through the granite corridor, where the rock walls rose up on either side, like the mountain itself was funneling her towards something it wanted her to see. She'd walked this corridor a dozen times since she bought the land, knew every shadow of it. Knew, too, that the men ahead of her had walked it like they'd walked it before. Not once. Many times. That thought sat wrong in her chest the whole way down. This is my land, she thought. 6 months mine. And somebody's been walking it longer than that. At the end of the corridor, the ground dropped away, and the valley opened up beneath her green, even in November, fed by a creek that never iced over no matter how hard the winter came down. Beautiful place. She'd bought the whole mountain because of this valley, because it was the one piece of ground on God's earth that still looked like nobody had ruined it yet. She saw the blood before she understood she was looking at it. Dark spots, scattered across pale stone near the water. Not much, not the wide dark pool of a clean kill. Something smaller, something that suggested motion. Panic. She went down the slope careful, hand over hand on the rock, and knelt by the nearest spot and touched it. Tacky, not dry. 12 hours, maybe less. She followed the trail, 30 feet, before it vanished into brush too thick to read. But she'd already seen enough to understand the shape of the story. A shot that didn't kill clean. An animal that ran wounded into the trees to die alone, slow, afraid. Her jaw tightened. She'd hunted, once, back when hunting was just something everybody in these mountains did to eat through winter. You killed clean. You respected the animal enough to make it quick. Whoever had done this hadn't cared whether it was quick. Whoever had done this had cared about something else entirely. She scanned the valley the way 3 ravens had taught her 20 years ago, back when she was young and green and convinced tracking was about the eyes. It wasn't about the eyes. It was about patience, about letting the land finish its sentence before you tried to guess the ending. It took her 3 minutes to find the blind. Well built. She had to give them that. Deadfall and camouflage netting, arranged to command a clean view of the water. Fresh a week old, maybe less put together by somebody who understood fieldcraft the way soldiers understood it, not the way weekend hunters pretended to. She approached slow, rifle up. Not because she expected anyone inside. Because caution had kept her alive this long and she didn't intend to break the streak on a Tuesday. The blind was empty, but it wasn't abandoned. Spent casings. A dozen of them, scattered across the dirt floor like somebody hadn't bothered to police their brass because they didn't think anybody was ever going to come looking. She picked one up, turned it in the light. Premium load. The kind that cost more per round than most men in this county, made in a day of honest labor. Somebody was paying real money to kill on her land. The question that mattered wasn't who. The question that mattered was what for. She'd told herself once, standing at not John, Nathaniel. She'd told herself once, standing at Nathaniel's grave with the dirt still dark and loose over the mound, that she was done. Done with badges. Done with tracking men through country that wanted them dead as much as she did. Done being the thing the territory used to whisper about in saloons, the ghost, the woman who finds anybody, anywhere, and brings them back dead more often than alive. She'd meant it, too. For a while. 5 years she'd meant it. 5 years of a coastal town that never came, a flat, quiet life that never happened, because his last words wouldn't let her go. The high country, he'd said. Blood on his lips, blood bubbling with every breath, his hand gripping hers so hard it left marks that lasted longer than the bruise should have. They're in the high country. Finish, shit. She hadn't understood what he meant. Not for years. Thought maybe it was the fever talking, the pain, the body shutting down and grabbing for anything that felt like unfinished business. She'd held him until the shaking stopped. Promised him out loud, into the wind, into the empty mountain air that didn't answer, that she would finish whatever he'd started. It had taken her 5 years to understand the promise had a shape. The shape was this mountain. She'd bought it 6 months ago. 2,000 acres of Colorado wilderness, so far from anything that the nearest neighbor lived 12 miles down a road that stopped existing the first hard snow of the season. She'd told the land agent she wanted somewhere quiet. She hadn't told him she was looking for the place her husband died, trying to protect. Hadn't needed to. The land had told her the moment she rode onto it, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt anywhere else in 5 years of running. Here. Now she stood in a blind full of premium brass, with blood drying on stone 40 feet behind her, and the drawer in her chest that she kept Nathaniel's memory locked inside creaked open whether she wanted it to or not. Is this it, she thought? Is this what you meant? The mountain didn't answer either. Mountains never did. But something in her old, cold, patient answered instead. Find out. The trail took her deeper. Rougher ground now, thicker brush. The kind of country that could break an ankle or a neck if a person got careless. She'd never fully explored this section. Told herself it was because it was dangerous. Truth was closer to the bone than that. Truth was she'd been afraid of what she'd find if she looked too hard, too fast, too soon. Some part of her had wanted to ease into the promise. Wanted a few months of pretending this was just a mountain and not a debt. That part of her was going to have to wait. She found the second watering hole an hour later, bigger, more open, a natural salt lick, worn smooth by generations of animal tongues. Prime ground. The kind of place every living thing on the mountain eventually had to visit, sooner or later, because water didn't care about hiding places, which made it perfect for somebody who wanted a guaranteed kill. She found the second blind without trying, and past it, drag marks, deep gouges where something heavy had been hauled uphill through the trees, away from the water, towards something. She followed. A quarter-mile on, brush and deadfall had been arranged with a deliberateness that made her stomach tighten before her mind caught up to why. She pushed a section of fallen timber aside. Wagon tracks, fresh, multiple sets. Ground worn smooth by months, maybe longer, of regular traffic. This wasn't new. This had been happening before she ever set foot on this mountain. Maybe while Amos Fielding still owned it. Maybe with his knowledge. Maybe without. She followed the hidden road half a mile, careful now, every sense open, and found where it joined the main Forest Service road 3 miles east. A perfect supply line. Invisible unless you already knew where to look. And at a bend in that hidden road, she found the frame. 2 trees, a crossbeam lashed between them, pulleys and chain hanging down like something out of a slaughterhouse, dropped onto a mountainside. The ground beneath it was black with old blood, and the smell, even in November cold, still clung to the air, thick and rotten and wrong. This wasn't a hunting camp. This was infrastructure. Scattered around the frame, tarps, butcher knives, industrial sacking, and piled off to one side, sorted with the kind of care a merchant gives his inventory: antler tips, claws, teeth, the parts worth money, the meat, worthless to whoever ran this operation, left to rot where it fell. Cora stood very still. She had seen ugly things in her years wearing a badge. Had seen men do worse to each other than this operation was doing to animals that couldn't fight back and couldn't testify. But there was something about the order of it, the sorting, the piles, the clean efficiency that turned her stomach in a way raw violence never had. This wasn't hunting. This was harvest. And somewhere 5 years ago, her husband had found this same frame. Had stood, maybe, on this same ground. Had understood, the way she was understanding now, that something enormous and organized was operating on this mountain. And it had killed him for knowing. She rode back to her cabin fast, jaw set, the cold no longer registering the way it had at dawn. There was work now, evidence to gather, a shape to the things starting to form in her mind, the way shapes always formed when she stopped trying to force them and let the pattern show itself instead. But first, town. She needed information the mountain couldn't give her. Cinder Hollow sat low in a wide valley 12 miles from her gate, a town of maybe 300 souls. Most of them ranchers or men who scraped a living out of the silver claims that had mostly played out a decade back. The kind of place where a stranger got noticed before they finished tying off their horse. She wasn't a stranger. That was almost worse. She was the widow Ashfield, the woman who lived alone up where Fielding used to be. The one nobody quite knew, and everybody had an opinion about anyway. Her horse Whistler, a rangy bay gelding with more patience than sense, carried her down the main street at an easy walk past the general store, past the freight office where two men were loading crates onto a wagon bed, and stopped mid-lift to watch her pass. Past the saloon, its doors propped open despite the cold, a handful of men inside going quiet as her shadow crossed the window glass. She felt every eye, always did. She tied Whistler outside the county land office and went in. The clerk was a thin, careful man named Aldous Pratt, 50 or close to it, ledgers stacked around him like fortifications. He looked up, and something in his face did the thing faces did around her, a flicker, quickly smoothed over, the look of a man deciding how much of himself to show. "Mrs. Ashfield." He set down his pen. "Don't see you in town much. Need to look at some land records." She kept her voice easy, flat, the voice she used to use in courtrooms, back when courtrooms were part of her life, the properties bordering mine. "Any particular reason?" "Curious about my neighbors." He hesitated a half-second, too long before he reached for the books, pulled 3 heavy volumes down and set them on the counter, and she noticed, because noticing was a habit, she'd never managed to unlearn that his hands weren't quite steady doing it. She opened the first ledger and started reading. 3 of the 4 properties bordering hers had changed hands in the last 18 months. All 3 sold to the same buyer, Kessler Land and Cattle Holdings. She hadn't heard the name before. Ran her finger down the column of dates, the pattern of it laying itself out plain as a confession. Quiet sales. No public notice. All handled through the same Denver law firm. "This company," she said, not looking up. "Local?" "Denver, far as I know." Pratt's voice had gone careful. Rehearsed, almost the sound of a man who'd answered this question before, or expected to. "Bought through lawyers. Never saw the man himself. Somebody's buying up a lot of ground around here. Land changes hands. That's business." She looked up then, and held his eyes long enough that he had to decide whether to hold hers back. He didn't. Not for long. "You know anything else about this company, Mr. Pratt?" "No, ma'am." His gaze dropped to the ledgers. "Just what's in the books." He was lying. Not well. Not even close to well. But well enough, maybe, that it would have fooled somebody who hadn't spent 15 years reading the small tells in a man's face. Right before he decided to hand her a lie instead of the truth, she let it go. For now. But before she closed the ledger, something else caught her eye, a line she almost skipped past, buried in the recording fees at the bottom of the 3rd property's transfer. A name, listed as legal counsel of record for the purchasing entity. Attorney of record, J. Vance, Esq., Denver. She stared at it a long moment. The name meant nothing to her. Not yet. Just 3 letters and a surname on a page full of other names that meant nothing to her either. But something about it snagged. The way a burr snags wool small, almost unnoticeable, except that it doesn't let go once it's caught. She copied it into the small notebook she carried, closed the ledger, and thanked Pratt with a courtesy she didn't entirely feel. Outside, the afternoon light had sharpened, gone that hard, clean gold that came right before a mountain winter really settled in. She stood on the boardwalk a moment, letting the cold clear her head, and then walked toward the small white church at the end of the street. If there was a soul in this town who knew more than he was saying, it was the priest. Father Elias Cormack had tended the church at Cinder Hollow for 20 years, and Cora found him where she'd expected to find him, in the small garden behind the rectory, kneeling in dirt gone hard with early frost, pulling the last of the season's vegetables before the ground closed up tight for winter. He looked up when her shadow crossed the rows. His face weathered, kind, tired in the particular way of men who'd spent decades absorbing other people's sins and had nowhere to set the weight down, broke into something that wanted to be a smile and mostly managed it. "Mrs. Ashfield." He rose, slow, brushing dirt from his knees. "This is a surprise, Father." She didn't waste time working up to it. Never had. "Amos Fielding. What can you tell me about him?" The almost smile disappeared. "Bill Amos has been dead 6 months." A pause. "Careful. Why are you asking?" "I bought his land. I'd like to know the man who owned it before me." Cormac studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that measured more than it revealed. Behind him, the garden sat silent, half-stripped, waiting for winter, the way everything up here waited for winter patiently, and with no illusions about who was going to win. Amos Fielding was a complicated man, he said finally. Good at heart, I always believed, but weak. He made choices he came to regret. What kind of choices? The priest looked past her, toward the mountains rising blue and distant at the edge of the valley. The kind we confess on our deathbeds, he said quietly. The kind we can't take back no matter how hard we pray for the chance. Did he confess to you? You know I can't answer that. Can't. She held his eyes. Or won't. Something moved behind his face, not anger. Something closer to grief. He turned back to her fully then, and his voice, when it came, had dropped into a register she hadn't heard from him before. Grave. Almost frightened. Amos Fielding died with a heavy conscience, Mrs. Ashfield. That's all I can tell you. A beat. But I will say this. If you're asking questions about his land, you should be very careful. Why? Some secrets are kept by the living. He held her gaze, and for just a moment she saw something old and tired move behind his eyes. Some are kept by the dead. Both kinds haunt a person, given enough time. She felt the chill of it settle somewhere under her ribs, and it had nothing to do with the November air. If you know something, Father? She kept her voice level, steady. The voice she'd used 100 times on frightened witnesses who needed to believe she wasn't going to let the ground open up under them. Something that might help me understand what's happening on my land. I know what I heard in confession, he said, and that stays between a man and God. He paused, looked down at his hands, still dirt-stained from the garden. But I know Amos tried to make things right before he died. He left a letter. A pause waited. A confession of sorts. Sealed. Her heart caught. Where is it? In my keeping. He met her eyes again. He asked me to give it to someone who might need it. Someone who might be able to finish what he couldn't. Am I that someone? Cormac studied her a long moment, long enough that she felt the whole weight of the question settle onto both of them at once. The way a held breath settles into ache. Come back tomorrow, he said finally. Let me pray on it tonight. If the Lord guides me to give it to you, I will. It wasn't what she wanted, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. Tomorrow, then. She turned to go, and that was when she saw him. Across the street, half in shadow beside the saloon's front window, a man in a deputy's coat stood frozen, watching her. Their eyes met. Whatever he saw in her face, it drained the color straight out of his. He turned and walked away fast, disappearing through the saloon doors like the building itself had reached out and pulled him inside. Cora stood in the cold a moment, watching the space where he'd been. Interesting, she thought. He's scared, and I haven't said a word to him yet. She found Nora Whitfield at the boarding house, hunched over a leather sketchbook at a table by the window, ink-stained fingers moving fast across the page in the particular concentration of someone who'd forgotten the rest of the world existed. The young woman looked up as Cora entered, and her face opened into recognition, quick and warm. Mrs. Ashfield. She closed the sketchbook, careful, like she was closing a door on something. I was hoping I'd see you, Miss Whitfield. Please, sit. Can I get you coffee? I'm fine. Cora sat anyway, studying the younger woman across the table, maybe 29, intelligent eyes, the kind of restless energy that came from spending more time with wild things than with people. A naturalist, she'd told the town, studying the elk herds that moved through the high valleys. I wanted to thank you, Nora said, for letting me work your land. That herd up there is remarkable. I've documented 17 individuals so far, and you've been on my property. Just the eastern section, near the main trail. A flicker of worry. I should have asked permission properly. I'm sorry, What have you seen? The question landed harder than Cora meant it to, and she watched something shift behind Nora's eyes, guarded now where it had been open a second before. The elk, mostly, Nora said carefully. Some bear sign, mountain lion tracks once. It's remarkable habitat, Mrs. Ashfield. Exactly what I came out here hoping to find. Anything else? A pause. Long enough to mean something. Why do you ask? Because I found a hunting operation on my land this morning. Cora kept her voice flat, even, The way she'd learned to deliver hard news without letting her own feeling about it get in the way. Professional. Organized. I'm wondering if you've seen anything that might help me understand who's running it. Nora was quiet a moment. Then she opened the several pages and drew out a single loose sheet she'd folded and tucked between the leaves. I did these 5 days ago. She held it out, hand not quite steady. Up near the North Ridge I saw well, see for yourself. Cora unfolded the page. The sketches were good, detailed. 3 men, rifles slung, standing near what was unmistakably the processing frame she'd found that same afternoon. The faces weren't clear, too far away. Too quick a look, but the gear was rendered in careful, precise lines. Tactical coats. High-end rifles, the kind that cost more than a ranch hand made in a season. When exactly? 5 days ago. I was out early trying to catch the herd at first light. I heard voices and I hid. Nora's hands twisted together on the table. They scared me, Mrs. Ashfield. The way they moved. The way they talked to each other. They weren't hunters. Not the kind I've met out here, anyway. Did they see you? I don't think so. I stayed hidden until they were gone. Haven't gone back up there since. Cora studied the sketch a long moment, memorizing every detail the way she used to memorize wanted posters, back when memorizing a face was half of what kept her alive. Can I keep this? Of course. Nora hesitated. Should I be worried? Is it safe for me to keep doing my research up there? Cora looked at her. Saw a young woman who'd come out here to do good, careful work, protecting something wild and vanishing, and who had no idea yet what kind of teeth this particular mountain had. No, she said honestly. It's not safe. These men are dangerous, and whatever they're protecting, they're willing to kill to keep it protected. Nora's face went pale. Kill? My husband died investigating this same operation. 5 years ago. The words came out steadier than she felt saying them. I'm going to finish what he started. But you should stay away from that ridge. Far away. I should leave town then. That would be smart. But even as Cora said it, she watched something change in the younger woman's face. Not the fear retreating, the fear stayed, plain as anything but something else moving in underneath it. Resolve. Stubborn and quiet and entirely unimpressed with the idea of running. No, Nora said. And her voice had gone steady in a way it hadn't been a moment before. I don't think I will. Miss Whitfield, if someone needs to testify about what I saw, I'll do it. She met Cora's eyes straight on. I came out here to protect something, Mrs. Ashfield. That's worth a little risk. Cora studied her for a long moment. Saw something she recognized, the particular stubborn courage of a person who believed in something larger than their own safety and who hadn't yet learned what that belief could cost. She'd been that person once, a long time ago, before Santa Fe, before the badge went into a drawer and stayed there. All right, she said finally, but stay in town. Don't go back up the mountain. Not until this is finished. What are you going to do? Cora stood, tucking the sketch inside her coat. What I do best, she said. I'm going to hunt. The general store was busy. When she got there, 3 or 4 townspeople gathered at the counter, voices pitched low in the particular murmur of people who'd rather not be overheard. The conversation died the moment she stepped through the door. Everyone turned to look. She let it wash over her the way she'd learned to let it wash over her. Years ago, no reaction, no flicker, just the flat patient calm of a woman who'd been stared at by worse men than shopkeepers and their wives. She walked to the counter. The clerk, a man named Osric Marsh, gave her a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Mrs. Ashfield, what can I get for you? 2 boxes of 45.70. Dried beans, coffee, salt. He gathered the order without further conversation, but she noticed his hands weren't entirely steady doing it, the same small tell she'd caught on Pratt at the land office, on Marrow across the street, on half this town it seemed like. Every single person, twitchy and careful, around her like she was a loaded gun, somebody'd left sitting on the bar. She paid. Turned to leave. That was when she heard it pitched low, meant not to carry, carrying anyway, the way whispers always did in a room gone quiet enough. That's her. The one that lives up at Fielding's old place. They say she used to be a lawwoman, before. More than that. They say she was the ghost. The room went dead silent. Cora stood very still, her hand on the door, and let the silence stretch a moment before she turned around slow and looked at the room. A dozen faces looking back at her, fear in some, curiosity in others, and under all of it, in almost every face, the particular wariness of people who suddenly weren't sure what kind of woman they'd been sharing a town with. "Something you want to ask me?" she said, quiet, to the room at large. Nobody answered. She picked up her supplies and walked out into the cold. But the damage, if that's what it was, had already been done. The whispers had started, and whispers in a town this size traveled faster than any rider could. By nightfall, everybody in Cinder Hollow would know that the quiet widow up on the mountain had another name buried under the one she used. Eleanor, she thought, riding out of town with the sun already dropping toward the peaks. No, not Eleanor. Not anymore. Just Cora Ashfield. Except that isn't true either, is it? Because the ghost didn't retire. She'd learned that much over the last 5 years, the hard way. Every time some old instinct rose up out of the drawer, she'd tried to lock it in, and reminded her that a name like that didn't wash off. You could bury it under a wedding, under a new surname, under 6 years of trying to be somebody softer. It waited, that was all it did. It waited for a reason to come back out. She had one now. Dusk was falling fast by the time she reached the cabin, the temperature dropping with the light the way it always did up here, sudden and total, like winter had simply been waiting behind the trees for permission. Whistler's breath steamed heavy in the cold as she led him into the small corral, fed him, checked his water, ran a hand along his neck. The way she did every evening, a ritual she'd built without meaning to. The small acts of care that kept a person tethered to the world when the rest of the day had been spent staring straight into something ugly. Inside, she lit the lamps and built up the fire and made coffee she didn't especially want but needed the ritual of making. Then she sat at the small table and spread out everything the day had given her. The land records, copied into her notebook. Nora's sketch of the 3 armed men. The spent casings from the blind, laid out in a careful row like evidence at a trial that hadn't happened yet. And waiting, still sealed, still a promise, rather than an answer, the shape of tomorrow's meeting with Father Cormac, and whatever Amos Fielding had confessed to before he died with a conscience too heavy to carry into the ground. She looked at the notebook page a long time, at the name she'd copied without quite knowing why it mattered. J. Vance, Esq Attorney of Record. A name on a page, buried in recording fees. The kind of detail that meant nothing to 99 people out of 100, and had snagged in her chest anyway. The way things snagged when some old instinct recognized a pattern before the conscious mind caught up. She reached into the small chest by her bed, the one she rarely opened, the one that still smelled faintly of leather and gun oil, and the particular dust of 5 years unopened, and pulled out a folder she hadn't looked at since the funeral. Nathaniel's case files. What little of them she'd kept. Most of it burned, most of it lost in the fire that took her first cabin during the standoff that hadn't happened yet. No. Wrong order. That fire was still ahead of her, though she didn't know it yet. Sitting at her table in the lamplight, with the past spread out in front of her like a map she was only now learning to read. She flipped through the brittle pages. Notes in Nathaniel's careful hand. Rumors about strange activity on the mountain properties. A name, half remembered from some meeting he'd mentioned in passing, back before she'd started paying close enough attention. Vance. There. 3rd page in. A single line, underlined twice, in Nathaniel's handwriting. V. Has friends in Denver nobody wants to name. Cora sat very still. The fire popped in the grate. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving through the pines with a sound like something breathing. She stared at the name a long time, feeling the shape of something enormous begin to take form just past the edge of what she could see clearly, the way a mountain range looked, from very far away, like nothing more than a smudge of blue haze on the horizon, right up until you got close enough to understand how much of it had been hidden by distance the whole time. A businessman's company, buying up land quietly through lawyers. A dead man's daughter, no. A dead man's confession waiting behind a locked church cabinet. A husband's 5-year-old notes, naming a man whose friends in Denver nobody wanted to say out loud. 3 threads. She didn't know yet if they tied together. didn't know yet how deep any of this went, or how far up it climbed, or whose hands had actually been on the other end of the blade that cut through Nathaniel's saddle girth on a ridge 5 years ago, and called it an accident of a spooked horse. But she knew, sitting there in the lamplight, with the wind rising outside and the fire burning low, that she was no longer looking at a poaching operation. She was looking at the edge of something with roots. And roots, she'd learned a long time ago, chasing men through territory that wanted them free as badly as she wanted them caught, always went deeper than the first shovel of dirt ever showed you. She banked the fire late, past midnight, and lay in the dark, listening to the wind work through the trees outside, and found she couldn't sleep the way she usually managed to clean, dreamless, the sleep of a person who'd trained her body a long time ago not to waste hours on things it couldn't control. Instead, she lay there and let herself think about him, really think, for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. Nathaniel hadn't been a lawman, hadn't wanted to be, hadn't understood, in the early years of their marriage, why she sometimes woke, gasping from dreams about men she'd tracked down and men she'd had to shoot, and one boy in an alley in Santa Fe who should have still been in school instead of dying with her bullet in his chest. He'd just been a rancher, a good, ordinary, decent man who noticed when something on the mountain didn't sit right, and who, because he was decent, because decent people couldn't help themselves, went looking for the reason why. That decency had killed him. She'd spent 5 years telling herself it was an accident, because the alternative was unbearable, because if it wasn't an accident, then someone had made a choice, deliberate and cold, to end a good man's life and dress it up as bad luck so nobody would ever look twice. Now, lying in the dark with a dead landowner's letter, waiting behind a locked cabinet, with a young naturalist's sketches of 3 armed strangers, with her own husband's 5-year-old handwriting, naming a man whose friends in Denver nobody wanted to say out loud. Now she understood. It hadn't been an accident. Somebody had planned it, the same way somebody had planned every quiet land sale, every cut wire, every hunting party paying premium money to slaughter animals. Nobody would ever prosecute them for killing. Somebody had built a machine on this mountain, patient and careful and well-funded, and her husband had gotten close enough to see its shape, and the machine had killed him for it, and called it a horse, throwing its rider on a ridge nobody thought to question. She lay very still in the dark, and felt the cold thing in her chest, the thing she'd told herself. That morning by the tripwires, wasn't fear settle into something with a name after all? Not fear. Purpose. Finish it, he'd said, blood on his lips. They're in the high country. Finish it. I'm going to, she said, out loud, into the empty cabin, into the dark that didn't answer any more than the mountain had answered her that morning. I promise you, I'm going to finish it. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and for just a moment, just one breath, just one heartbeat, it sounded almost like a voice answering back. She told herself it was only the wind. She almost believed it. Morning came hard and bright, the kind of clean, cold light that made the whole valley look freshly made, like the night's business hadn't happened at all. Cora was up before the sun cleared the ridge, moving through the small rituals that kept a solitary life running: fire built, coffee made, Whistler fed and watered, rifle checked and cleaned, though it hadn't fired a shot the day before. She rode into Cinder Hollow, with the promise of Father Cormac's letter sitting in her chest like a held breath. The town looked different this morning. Or maybe she was the one who'd changed, and the town was only reflecting it back at her, the same wary glances. But sharper now, more people finding reasons to be somewhere else the moment her shadow crossed their path. Word had traveled overnight, the way word always traveled in a place this small. The widow up at Fielding's place. The ghost. Asking questions about company men and dead landowners. She didn't care. Hadn't come here to be liked. She tied Whistler outside the church, and went in, and found Father Cormac waiting for her in the small office behind the altar, the sealed envelope already sitting on the desk in front of him like he'd been holding it, unable to set it down, since the moment he'd made his decision. He looked up when she entered. His face was drawn. Tired in a way that went past a bad night's sleep, the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent the small hours arguing with his own conscience and wasn't entirely certain which side had won. Mrs. Ashfield. He didn't rise this time. Just gestured to the chair across from him. I thought you might come, you made your decision. I prayed on it most of the night. He looked down at the envelope, and for a moment his hand rested on it, the way a man's hand rests on something he's afraid to let go of. Amos gave me this 3 days before he died. Made me promise to keep it safe, to give it to someone who might need it. He slid it across the desk toward her. I believe you're that someone. Cora reached out, slow, and took the envelope. The paper was yellowed, brittle at the edges, the wax seal still unbroken after 6 months in a locked cabinet. Did he say what's in it? A confession. Cormac's voice had gone heavy. Names, dates, things he witnessed, and was too frightened to report, while he was still alive, to face the consequences of reporting them. He looked at her, and something old and sorrowful moved behind his eyes. He was a weak man, Mrs. Ashfield. I want you to understand that before you read it. Weak but not evil. They gave him reasons to be afraid that most men wouldn't have withstood either. Who threatened him? Read the letter. His voice had gone very quiet. It's all there. Everything I couldn't tell you myself. Cora broke the seal. The paper inside was covered in shaky handwriting, the kind of unsteady script that came from a hand fighting through pain or fear, or both at once. She began to read, and the room around her seemed to fall away, the way it always did when she was reading something that was about to change the shape of everything she thought she understood. If you are reading this, I am already gone, and I am sorrier than these pages can hold for every year I let this go on. The letter detailed 8 years. 8 years of a hunting operation, running on Fielding's land, hidden and patient, and growing more organized every season. A man approaching him early on, not Kessler, the letter made clear, but a representative acting on Kessler's behalf offering payment to look away. Fielding refusing at first. Fielding shown photographs, later of his own daughter in Denver, and told plainly what would happen to her if he didn't cooperate. Cora's hands had gone very still on the page, so he'd cooperated, taken the money, watched, from the porch of his own house, as strangers built infrastructure on his land and slaughtered what lived there for parts and profit, and told himself every single year that next season he'd find the courage to stop it, and never had. And then near the bottom, in handwriting that had grown shakier still, like the man writing it had needed to force his hand to keep moving, Kessler is not the one who built this. He is only the one whose name is on the papers. The man who truly runs this operation, the man whose money and whose protection make it untouchable, is a man I met only once, in Denver, in a room with no windows, a man the others addressed as Senator. I did not learn his full name. I was not meant to. But I remember what Kessler called him when he thought I could not hear Vance. Cora sat very still, the paper trembling slightly in her hands, though whether from the cold in the room or something colder moving through her chest, she couldn't have said. Father Cormac was watching her, his face grave. There's more, he said quietly. Amos mentioned a ledger, hidden in his old barn. He told me where to find it before he died, in case someone ever came looking who needed proof stronger than a dying man's word. Cora looked up from the letter. Where? I'll take you, the priest said. But Mrs. Ashfield, I need you to understand what you're about to be holding. These are not careless men. If what Amos wrote is true, they've killed before to protect this, and they will kill again. I know. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. My husband was one of the ones they killed. The priest's face changed, a flicker of something like grief crossing it, quick and genuine. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Neither did I. She folded the letter carefully, the way a person folds something they intend to carry a long way. Not until this morning. She stood, the confession clutched in one hand, the weight of it settling into her chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it already moving outward, already touching every corner of what she thought she understood about her own life, her husband's death, the mountain she'd bought, hoping to find peace on, and instead had found the exact opposite. Not peace. A war that had started 5 years before she ever knew she was already standing in the middle of it. She followed Father Cormac out of the church and into the cold, bright morning. And somewhere behind her, unseen, unremarked, a man in the shadow of the saloon watched her go, the same man who had fled at the sight of her the evening before, watching now with an expression that was less fear than something closer to dread, the look of a man who understood, better than anyone else in Cinder Hollow, exactly how much danger had just ridden quietly into town. The name written in her husband's 5-year-old handwriting. The name buried in a dying man's confession. The name at the bottom of a legal document. Nobody was supposed to notice. Vance. 3 threads, and every one of them led toward the same dark center. Cora Ashfield mounted her horse in the cold morning light, the letter tucked inside her coat, where her heart could feel its weight with every breath, and understood with a certainty that settled over her, like the frost that had covered the mountain the morning before, that whatever she had walked into, it was bigger, older, and far more dangerous than 3 men with expensive rifles cutting through gut-line wire in the dark. Somewhere in Denver, a man with friends nobody wanted to name had been building something on her mountain for 8 long years. And nobody, not Fielding, not Kessler, not the frightened deputy across the street, not the whole quiet, watchful town of Cinder Hollow, had dared to say his full name. Out she would. Before this was finished, she would say it loud enough that every man hiding behind it heard his name and understood, finally, that the widow on the mountain wasn't hiding anymore. She was hunting. The barn hadn't been touched since Fielding died. 6 months of dust lay over everything like a held breath. Cora stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust to the gloom, and Father Cormac came in behind her, carrying a lantern that threw more shadow than light. He told me the loft, Cormac said, under the 3rd board from the ladder. He was very specific about that. 3rd board. He counted them. A dying man counts everything, Mrs. Ashfield. Steps to the door. Breathes in a minute. Boards in a floor he built with his own hands 30 years ago, and never once thought he'd need to remember which one hid the truth. She climbed. The ladder complained under her weight, old wood settling into old grooves, and she found the loft half full of moldering hay and the particular smell of a place that animals had stopped living in a long time before the man who owned it stopped living too. 3rd board. She knelt, pressed her palm flat against the wood, and felt it give, just slightly, under pressure that shouldn't have given at all. A gap, cut clean, filled and hidden, so well that a man could have walked this loft 100 times and never known. She pried it up. The ledger underneath was wrapped in oilcloth, dry, preserved the way only careful hands preserved things they were afraid somebody might need someday. She unwrapped it in the lantern light. Pages and pages. Dates running back 8 years. Columns of numbers in a hand that started steady and grew shakier the further it went, like watching a man's conscience erode in real time across a decade of entries. Payment received. 500. K. Payment received. 500. K over and over. The same amount, twice a year, like clockwork, like a debt nobody ever forgave and nobody ever forgot to collect. And then halfway through, a different hand starts appearing in the margins. Not Fielding's. Somebody else's notes, added later, cross-referencing names against the payments, like somebody had gone back through this ledger after the fact and built a second layer of truth on top of the first. She recognized the second hand, because she'd read enough of it, 5 years ago, in evidence files she'd sworn she'd never look at again. Nathaniel. He'd found this ledger, or a copy of it, or something close enough that he'd started cross-referencing the same names, in the same margins, in his own careful rancher's hand, months before he died. Her breath caught somewhere high in her chest and stayed there. Father. Her voice didn't sound like her own voice. This is my husband's handwriting. Cormac climbed halfway up the ladder, lantern raised. Are you certain? I'd know it anywhere. Which meant Nathaniel hadn't just heard rumors about a hunting operation on the mountain properties. Which meant he'd found this ledger or Fielding to him, quietly, desperately, the way a drowning man shows a stranger where the current's pulling, and Nathaniel had sat right here, maybe in this same loft, and started matching names to payments the way she was matching them now. She kept reading, and 2/3 of the way down the 9th page, a name jumped off the paper at her, like it had been waiting 5 years for her to finally arrive and see it. W. Boyd, 2000, semi-annual. Her whole body went still, because that name wasn't a stranger's name. That name belonged to a man who'd stood at her husband's grave, with his hat pressed to his chest, and told her, voice cracking, that he was sorry, that he'd searched every inch of that ridge himself, that there wasn't a single thing that pointed to anything but a horse and bad luck and a man who'd trusted the wrong footing on wet stone. Walter Boyd, Nathaniel's partner, the man who'd written the report calling it an accident, the man who'd sat in her kitchen a dozen times over the years, drinking her coffee, laughing at Nathaniel's jokes, promising her that if anything ever went wrong out on the range, he'd be the first man riding to help. $2,000, twice a year, for 8 years. She sat down hard on the loft floor, the ledger heavy in her lap, and for one long moment the barn around her seemed to tilt, the way ground tilts under a person who's just understood the floor they've been standing on was never solid at all. Mrs. Ashfield. Cormac's voice, careful, from the ladder. Are you all right? She wasn't. She didn't say so, because saying it out loud would make it real, and some small, stubborn, still hoping part of her wanted one more second, just one of not knowing. That second passed, and she was still holding the ledger, and the name was still there, and nothing she wanted was going to unwrite it. I need to find him, she said. Today. She rode into Cinder Hollow with the ledger wrapped tight against her chest, and the whole way down the mountain, she rehearsed nothing. Because there was nothing to rehearse. What did a person say to the man who'd let her husband die and then held her hand at the funeral and called it a tragedy? You knew. That was the whole of it. 2 words and everything underneath them. She found him at the Grand Hotel. Room 12. Boyd had ridden into town 3 days back. The desk clerk told her. Business he hadn't specified, though his hands had gone visibly unsteady saying so, the way everybody's hands went unsteady lately when Cora Ashfield asked them a direct question. She climbed the stairs, knocked, footsteps, a pause too long for a man with nothing to hide. Then the door opened, and Walter Boyd stood there, older than she remembered, gray threading through hair that used to be dark, lines carved deep around eyes that widened the moment they landed on her face. Cora. He tried a smile. It came apart halfway through building itself. I heard you were in town. Heard you were asking questions. I found the ledger, Walter. The smile finished dying. Why don't you come in, he said, very quiet. We can talk. She went in. The room was neat. Too neat. A bottle of whiskey sitting open on the table, 1 glass beside it, already half empty though it wasn't yet noon. 8 years, she said, standing in the middle of the room, the ledger clutched against her ribs, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. $2,000. Twice a year. That's what my husband's life was worth to you. $16,000. Spread out over. It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like. Her hand drifted, without her telling it to, toward the revolver at her hip. Boyd saw it. Went white. They had my daughter, he said. Fast now. Words tumbling over each other like a dam giving way all at once after 8 years holding. Isabella. She lives in Denver. Voss's men, Kessler's men, they showed me photographs. Told me exactly what would happen to her if I didn't cooperate. I didn't have a choice, Cora. I swear to you, I didn't. You had a choice. Her voice came out flat, cold. A voice she hadn't used in 5 years and hadn't missed. You chose? Every single payment, twice a year, for 8 years. That's not one choice, Walter. That's 16. He flinched like she'd struck him. I told him to drop it. His voice cracked. Nathaniel. I told him to let it go. Told him there wasn't anything up there worth dying over. But he wouldn't listen. He kept pushing, kept digging, and you told them. Silence. The kind of silence that answered a question better than any words could have. Walter. I told them he was close. The words came out barely above a whisper, like saying them any louder might make them impossible to survive. I told Kessler that Nathaniel had found the ledger, that he was about to take it to the federal office. I thought, God help me, Cora. I thought they'd just scare him. Threaten him the way they'd threatened me. I didn't think. You didn't think they'd kill him? No. But they did. He was crying now. An old man crying in a hotel room, the whiskey glass shaking in his hand, and Cora stood in the middle of the room and felt nothing she recognized as mercy. "I've lived with it every day for 5 years," he said. "I can't sleep, can't look at myself in a mirror without, good." The word came out of her like a blade. Clean. Final. He looked up at her, shocked, like he'd expected what? Forgiveness, understanding? Some small mercy extended from one grieving person to another. Because misery loved company and he'd apparently spent 5 years hoping his misery might buy him hers. It wouldn't. Not today. Maybe not ever. "Where's your daughter now?" Cora said. "Chicago. I sent her away 3 years ago. Told her never to come back to Denver." He wiped his face with the back of one shaking hand. "She doesn't know why. Doesn't know any of it. So you've been safe for 3 years." Cora's voice had gone very quiet, and quiet in her experience frightened people worse than shouting ever did. "And you kept taking Kessler's money anyway." "I didn't know how to stop." His voice broke apart entirely. "I was afraid of what they'd do if I tried to walk away." She stood there a long moment, looking at him, really looking, the way she used to look at men across an interrogation table, cataloging every tremor, every flicker, every small tell that separated a lie from a truth a man could barely stand to say out loud. He wasn't lying, not about the fear, maybe not about any of it. It didn't matter. Silas Drummond. No wrong name, a name from somewhere else entirely, and she caught herself before it left her mouth, shook it off. "Who does Kessler answer to, Walter?" Boyd's face changed. Something moved behind his eyes, real fear now, a different flavor of it than the fear he'd been drowning in a moment ago. "I don't know his full name," he said. "Kessler's careful. Never says it outright, but I've heard it once or twice, in rooms I wasn't supposed to be listening in, Vance." Boyd's whole body went still. How many men does Kessler have?" Cora cut in. "Local. Armed. Answering directly to him. 12. Last I knew. 8 are guides, laborers, men who just handle the animals once they're down." He swallowed hard. 4 are different. Ex-military, most of them. A man named Ezra Cole runs that side of it. Dangerous. Trained. The kind of men who don't ask questions, just follow orders. And Cole answers to Kessler. "Kessler answers to somebody," Boyd said, voice dropping lower still, like even in an empty hotel room he was afraid of being overheard saying it. "I don't know who." "Nobody does. Not really. Except maybe Cole himself. But whoever it is, Cora, whoever's really running this, it's bigger than a land grab. Bigger than poaching. I've seen the shipping manifests. Crates going out marked as mining equipment that never once went near a mine." Cora's pulse picked up, slow and steady, the way it always had right before a piece finally clicked into place. "What kind of equipment?" "I don't know. I never saw inside the crates." Boyd looked at her, and for just a moment, under all the guilt and fear and 8 years of cowardice, she saw a flash of the man Nathaniel used to trust. "But I know this much. Whatever Kessler's really protecting up on that mountain, it isn't animals, Cora. The animals are just the cover." She stood there a long time, letting that settle. Because if the animals were only cover, if the hunting parties, the trophies, the whole bloody machine of it, was just a story built to explain why armed men kept walking a stretch of federal wilderness nobody was supposed to be walking, then something else was happening under all of it. Something Nathaniel had gotten close enough to see. Something that had gotten him killed for seeing it. "You're going to testify," she said. "Not a question. When the federal marshals come. Everything you just told me." Boyd's face crumpled. "They'll kill me." Maybe she turned toward the door. "But if you don't, I'll make sure you spend whatever's left of your life in a federal prison instead of a quiet grave. Your choice, Walter. Same as it's always been." She left him there, standing in the wreck of his own 8-year silence, and didn't look back once on her way down the stairs. She didn't ride straight home, because there was one more place she needed to go, and she'd been putting it off for 5 years. And something about the ledger, about Nathaniel's handwriting in the margins, about a name written in a dying man's confession, had finally burned through whatever excuse she'd been using to avoid it. The ridge. She found the trail easily enough. 5 years hadn't changed it much. Same rocks. Same long clean view down into the valley below. The kind of view a man might have loved right up until the moment it became the last thing he ever saw. She dismounted and stood at the edge of it, looking down at the exact spot where she'd once knelt with his blood soaking through the knees of her dress, and for a long moment she couldn't make her feet move any closer. "Ground never lies," a voice said, somewhere far back in her memory. Old patient. Kiowa accented English learned late in a long life. Men lie. Ground tells truth. 3 ravens. 20 years gone from her life and still showing up exactly when she needed him, the way good teachers always did. She made herself walk closer, knelt where Boyd's report said the horse had thrown him, ran her palm across stone gone smooth with 5 years of weather, and something in the arrangement of the rocks nearby caught her attention the way a wrong note catches a trained ear, not loud, not obvious, just slightly, subtly off. Too neat, too deliberately stacked, for rocks that were supposed to have simply fallen where a startled animal's hooves had scattered them. She began moving them, one at a time, careful, methodical, the way 3 ravens had taught her to read a scene before she ever tried to read a trail. Start with what doesn't belong, and work outward from there. And then her fingers found something that wasn't stone at all. Fabric, weathered, sun-bleached, wedged tight between 2 rocks, like somebody had hidden it there on purpose, and left it exactly where they'd hidden it, undisturbed for 5 long years. Nathaniel's hat. Her hands went cold. Her whole chest went cold, actually, a wave of it moving through her so fast and so total that for a moment she couldn't breathe around it. She pulled the hat free. The leather band inside had cracked with age, but it was still there, still holding its shape, still smelling, faintly, impossibly of him. Or maybe that was only her mind supplying a memory her body wanted so badly it invented the evidence. And tucked inside the band, folded tight, small enough to have survived 5 years of weather without ever being found, a piece of paper. Her hands shook unfolding it, because she already knew, somehow, before she'd even read a single word, that whatever was written on this paper was going to change everything she thought she understood about the last 5 years of her life. "If you're reading this, I'm probably dead." His handwriting. Unmistakable. The same careful, slanted hand she'd read in love letters and grocery lists and margin notes in a dead man's ledger not 3 hours ago. "Vance knows I'm close. Walter's acting strange. I think he's compromised, though God help me, I don't want to believe it. Meeting Boyd today at the ridge. Taking precautions in case I'm wrong to trust him. The evidence is in the old mine shaft. East face of the mountain, 100 yards below the split pine. Everything you'll need to bring them down is there. Not just Kessler, not just the hunting. Something bigger, federal land. Something bigger, something they're planning to take out of this mountain that has nothing to do with animals at all. Finish this, Cora. Promise me." She read it 3 times. Her vision blurred the second time through, and she had to stop, breathe, wipe her eyes with the back of one shaking hand before she could finish the third. He'd known. He'd known he might be walking into his own death, and instead of turning back, instead of riding home to her, the way any sensible man would have, he'd taken 5 careful minutes to write this note and hide it where only somebody who truly knew how to look would ever find it. He'd trusted her to look. He'd trusted her to become, again, the woman she'd spent 5 years trying not to be. She folded the note with hands that had finally stopped shaking, tucked it into her coat beside the ledger and Fielding's confession, and stood, slow, feeling something settle into place inside her chest that hadn't been settled in 5 long years. Not grief. Not exactly. Something adjacent to grief but harder, sharper. Direction. "East face," she said out loud. To the wind, to the ridge, to whatever was left of him that might still be listening. 100 yards below the split pine. She mounted Whistler and turned him toward the mountain's east flank, and the light was already beginning to slant gold and low across the peaks, and she rode into it without once looking back at the place where he'd died. Because looking back wasn't going to bring him home. Finishing what he started might, in the only way that mattered anymore, still manage to. The mine shaft sat exactly where the note said it would, half collapsed, the timber framing around its entrance gone gray and soft with decades of weather. An old silver claim, the kind scattered across half these mountains, abandoned the moment the ore ran thin, and the men chasing it moved on to chase something else, somewhere else. She lit a lantern and squeezed through the narrow opening, and the dark closed around her, the way dark always closed around a person underground, total, patient, indifferent to whatever fear a human being carried into it. The shaft ran back 30 feet before opening into a small chamber, and there, in a rusted metal box half buried under loose rock, exactly where he'd promised, she found it. Documents. Photographs. A leather satchel gone brittle with age but still intact, still holding everything a careful, frightened, determined man had managed to gather in the weeks before somebody decided he'd gathered enough. She sat on the cold stone floor and went through it by lantern light, and the deeper she went the colder the room seemed to get, though she knew that wasn't the temperature at all. Photographs first. Kill sites, dozens of them, animals reduced to trophies and rot, dates scrawled on the back in Nathaniel's hand. Then shipping manifests, crates marked mining, equipment, consigned to addresses in Denver, that, cross-referenced against another sheet in the satchel, traced back to a holding company registered under a name she now recognized without needing to be told twice. Kessler Land and Cattle Holdings. And beneath that, a survey map. Federal land clearly marked, a boundary line running directly through the eastern section of what was now her property, the same section where she'd found the processing frame, the same ground the hidden road had carried her toward. Someone had drawn, in careful red ink, a series of markings across that federal boundary. Notations she didn't fully understand. Depth measurements. Something that looked, to her untrained eye, like the beginnings of a mining survey conducted, illegally, on land the federal government had set aside specifically to keep men like Kessler out of it. And at the bottom of the stack, a single sheet, different from the others, a personal letter, unfinished, in Nathaniel's hand, clearly meant for the Federal Land Office, and never sent. I have reason to believe the hunting operation on the properties bordering mine is a deliberate cover for unauthorized survey and extraction activity on federally protected land. The animals are not the object, they are the excuse. I believe the true purpose of this operation is to establish access and documentation, sufficient to support a future claim, legitimate or otherwise, on mineral rights beneath ground that is not, and should never be, for sale. I believe this operation has protection reaching well beyond the county. I do not yet know how far. I am close to identifying the man at the center of it. When I do, I will. The letter ended there, unfinished, because whatever came after I will had died with him on a ridge, dressed up as an accident, filed and forgotten for 5 years until a widow with nothing left to lose finally decided to stop running from a promise. Cora sat in the cold dark a long time, the lantern burning low, the full shape of it finally, terribly clear, not poaching, not even close to only poaching. Somewhere above her, right now, on ground she'd bought thinking she was buying peace, a network reaching from a dead landowner's fear all the way up to a Denver senator, whose full name nobody dared say out loud, was quietly, patiently, methodically preparing to strip something enormous out of federally protected wilderness and killing anyone who got close enough to notice. She packed everything carefully back into the satchel, sealed it, and crawled out of the shaft into a sky already going dark with the fast, total dusk of the high country. Her breath fogged in front of her. Somewhere behind her, deep in the mountain silence, she thought she heard nothing. Just wind. Just her own pulse, loud in her ears after an hour spent kneeling in that cold stone chamber, with the whole weight of it settling onto her shoulders, one document at a time. But she rode home faster than she needed to, because something in her old, trained, never quite as retired as she liked to believe, had started whispering that the mountain wasn't as empty as it looked. She didn't sleep that night, not really. Sat instead at her small table, with the lamp burning low, everything spread out in front of her, the way a general spreads a map before a battle he already knows is coming. The ledger, Fielding's confession, Nathaniel's letter and his unfinished report, Nora's sketch of 3 armed strangers standing over the processing frame. 7 pieces. She counted them, twice, the way she used to count evidence before walking into a courtroom, because counting steadied her hands even when nothing else could. 7 pieces, and every single one of them pointed the same direction, which meant tomorrow she needed to send word to Denver, which meant tonight she needed to prepare for the possibility that word wouldn't arrive fast enough, because Walter Boyd knew she'd found the ledger. And Walter Boyd, weak as he was, frightened as he was, still answered to men who paid him twice a year to stay quiet, and she had no way of knowing, sitting alone in a cabin 12 miles from the nearest help, whether his loyalty to a dead friend's memory would hold, or whether fear for a daughter in Chicago would win out the way it had won out for 8 straight years already. She checked her rifle, cleaned it, though it didn't need cleaning, because her hands needed something to do besides shake. She checked the revolver 6 rounds, extra boxes stacked by the door, and somewhere past midnight, sitting in the dark with the fire burned down to embers, she found herself thinking not about Kessler, not about Vance, not even about the mine shaft or the ledger or the whole terrible architecture of it. She found herself thinking about Nathaniel's handwriting. "Finish this, Cora. Promise me." "I am," she said quiet. To the dark cabin, to the dying fire, to whatever was left listening. "I promise you, I am." Outside, the wind picked up, moving hard through the pines, and this time she didn't tell herself it was only the wind. 3 days passed before anything happened, and every one of them, Cora, spent the same careful way patrolling the boundary at dawn, riding into town in the afternoon to send her telegram and gather what news she could, returning before dark to check the wire, the traps, the small alarms she'd rebuilt twice as thorough as before. The telegram went out on the 2nd day, addressed to a name she hadn't used in 5 years, sent to a man in Denver she'd once trusted with her life more times than either of them had bothered to count. Marshal Caleb Reyes. Have evidence major federal violations. Land corruption. Murder. Need support soonest. E. Ashfield. She'd almost signed it Kincaid, stopped herself at the last second, some old caution winning out over the satisfaction of finally using the name again. Soon enough, she told herself. Soon enough she'd use it as loud as she wanted. On the 3rd day, riding back from town with the light already fading gold behind the western ridge, she felt it before she saw anything. A wrongness in the air. The particular stillness that fell over a mountain when the animals had already decided something dangerous was moving through it and had gone quiet and careful the way animals always did when men with guns started walking ground they didn't belong on. She slowed Whistler to a walk, scanned the tree line. Nothing. Except there, a flicker of movement, gone before her eyes fully registered it, off in the brush maybe 40 yards north of the trail. She didn't stop, didn't let her pace change. Kept riding, easy and unhurried, the way a person rides when they haven't noticed anything at all, while every nerve in her body screamed the opposite. Somebody's watching, which means they know where I ride, which means they've been watching longer than today, which means she cut the thought off before it could spiral, the way she'd trained herself to do a long time ago in rooms far more dangerous than an empty mountain trail. Because panic gets people killed. Because the only thing that keeps a person alive in this kind of moment is staying exactly as calm, exactly as ordinary, as they'd have looked 5 minutes before they knew they were being watched. She rode home, fed Whistler, built up the fire the way she did every evening, moving through the ritual of an ordinary night with every sense stretched as wire. And that night, for the first time since she'd bought this mountain, she slept with her boots on, her rifle within arm's reach, and one ear listening even in her dreams. The voices came at 4 in the morning, distant at first, barely audible over the wind, and for one heavy half-conscious second she almost convinced herself she'd imagined them. Except she hadn't, because Whistler was already awake in the corral, ears pinned forward, stamping hard against the frozen ground, the way he only stamped when something out past the tree line had spooked him badly. Cora came off the floor with the rifle already in her hands. The fire had burned down to embers, gray light just beginning to touch the eastern peaks through the window glass. 4:30. Too early for anything honest. Perfect timing for men who weren't. She pulled on her boots already half on. She'd slept in them for exactly this reason and moved to the door without a sound, The way 5 years of trying to forget how to move this quietly hadn't managed to erase a single lesson. Outside, the cold hit her like a wall. She grabbed her field glasses off by the door and slipped out into the dark, moving low along the tree line toward the rocky outcrop behind the cabin, the same high ground she'd used before, without quite understanding, until this exact moment, that some part of her had chosen this cabin's position specifically because that outcrop gave a clear line down over the whole approach. Old habit, she thought, climbing fast, silent, breath held tight in her chest. Old habits build a house the same way old fear builds a fortress. Which is to say, without ever telling you it's happening. Which is to say, I've been preparing for this exact morning, since the day I first walked this land. She reached the outcrop and settled flat against the cold stone, raised the field glasses, and found them. Wagons. 4 of them, moving slow along the eastern trail, no lanterns lit, the men driving them handling the route with the easy confidence of people who'd traveled it more than once before. She counted heads as they climbed down. 12. Her stomach dropped, cold and total, though she'd known, hadn't she, that 12 was the number. Boyd had told her 12. Some part of her had hoped he was wrong. Some small, tired, 38-year-old part of her had hoped, right up until this exact second, that 12 was an exaggeration born of fear and 8 years of guilt. It wasn't. 12 men. Rifles slung, moving with the disciplined efficiency of soldiers rather than the loose sprawl of hired hands, and out in front of them, unmistakable even at this distance, a man whose bearing alone marked him as different from the rest. Military posture, confident, economical movement. A man who'd clearly spent years learning exactly how to walk into danger without wasting a single motion doing it. Ezra Cole, she thought. So this is you. The one Boyd was afraid to even name above a whisper. They fanned out, forming a loose perimeter around her cabin at a distance of maybe 200 yards. Positioning themselves, she recognized the shape of it instantly, the tactical patience of it to block every possible line of retreat. They weren't here to negotiate. They're here to finish what the wire cutting and the watching started. Which means somebody decided 3 days of patience was enough. Which means Walter talked. Or somebody saw me at the mine shaft. Or she cut the thought off again. Because it doesn't matter now which thread pulled them here. Because right now, this exact moment, 12 armed men are surrounding my home, and the only thing that matters is what happens in the next hour. She settled behind a boulder large enough to break her silhouette, rested the sharps across the cold stone, and began, with hands that had gone perfectly steady the way they always did once the waiting finally ended, to do the math a person did before a fight they intended to survive. Distance, wind, elevation. 12 men and one of her. Good odds, said some old, cold, familiar voice in the back of her mind, the voice of the ghost, the voice she'd spent 5 years pretending had died with the badge she'd turned in. You've faced worse. You've won worse. So stop counting them like enemies and start counting them like targets. Because that's the only math that's ever kept you breathing. She picked her first shot. Not a man. The lead wagon's rear axle disabled the retreat before the fight even started. Force whatever came next to happen on ground she controlled. In terrain only she truly understood. She breathed in. Let half of it out. Slow. The way 3 ravens had taught her a lifetime ago on a plain 300 miles from here. And squeezed the trigger. The sharps roared, the sound rolling out across the valley like the mountain itself had decided to speak, and the lead wagon's axle exploded in a shower of splinters and iron. Chaos, instant and total. Men scattering, shouting, diving for whatever cover the open ground offered, and Cora was already moving 30 yards left, low, fast, the rifle cradled tight against her chest before the echo of the first shot had finished dying against the rocks. She found new cover, sighted the second wagon's front wheel. Fired again. The rim shattered, the wagon lurched sideways, and more shouting rose up from below, men firing blind into the dark, bullets cracking off stones somewhere well behind, where she'd actually been standing a half-second before. They're rattled, she thought, moving again, always moving. The terrain her only ally and the only ally she needed. Because they expected a woman alone with a rifle. Not a ghost who knows this ground better than they know their own names. She circled north, found a new position, waited. A man broke from cover, running low toward the cabin trying to flank her position. She realized, trying to close the distance, while she was busy dealing with the wagons. She fired. The round kicked dirt 2 feet in front of his boots. A warning. Not a kill. Because I'm not ready to start killing yet, she thought, watching him dive back into cover, watching the message land the way she'd meant it to land. Because there's a difference between defending my home and starting a war I can't walk back from. Except that line's getting thinner every second this goes on. Except, I don't know how much longer I get to choose which side of it I'm standing on. Cole was shouting orders now, down below, his voice carrying just far enough for her to catch the shape of it without the words. Trying to organize his men. Trying to pin down her position from the muzzle flashes. He was good. She could see that, even from here, the way he moved his men. The way he read the terrain, adjusting, adapting, closing gaps. Not good enough. Because this mountain was hers, every rock and shadow of it memorized over 6 months, of walking it alone at every hour of the day and night, and 12 armed men with military training still couldn't outthink ground they'd only ever seen from the outside. She moved again, fired again, kept them pinned, kept them guessing, kept the fight happening on her terms and nobody else's. An hour passed. Maybe 2 time had gone strange the way it always went strange. In the middle of something like this, minutes stretching and compressing without any regard for a clock she couldn't have checked anyway. And then, through the field glasses, she caught something that stopped her cold. 2 men, separated from the rest, moving not toward the cabin at all, moving instead toward the small root cellar, dug into the hillside, 20 yards behind it, where she kept preserves, tools, and hidden in a locked chest under the floorboards, everything she'd gathered in the last 3 days. The ledger, Fielding's confession, Nathaniel's unfinished letter and the documents from the mine shaft. Her whole chest went cold in a way the fight itself hadn't managed. They're not here to kill me, she thought, the realization landing hard and sudden, the shape of the whole night rearranging itself around it. Or not only that, because if killing me was the only goal, 12 men don't split into search parties in the middle of an active fight. 12 men press the advantage. 12 men finish it fast, before reinforcements can arrive, which means they're not just hunting me, which means they're hunting the evidence, which means somebody talked, or somebody saw me at the shaft, or Walter, God help him. Walter finally cracked under whatever pressure they put on him the moment he understood. I knew his name was in that ledger, except it doesn't matter now which one. Except what matters is those 2 men reaching that cellar before I stopped them. She was already moving, sliding down off the outcrop faster than was strictly safe, rifle in one hand, the other bracing against stone gone slick with frost, her whole body running on a kind of cold, clear purpose that left no room for fear at all. She came around the back of the cabin low and fast, and the 2 men at the cellar door froze at the sound of her boots on frozen ground, spinning toward her with rifles half raised. She was faster. 1 shot. The nearest man went down hard, and she didn't stop to see how badly, already pivoting toward the second who'd found enough sense in the half-second available to him to dive sideways instead of standing his ground. She fired again. Missed. The man scrambled behind the cellar's stone foundation and returned fire, and she felt the round crack past, close enough to hear it, close enough that some old animal part of her flinched hard before her training caught up and steadied her hands again. Back off the cellar, she shouted, the words tearing out of her raw and furious, 5 years of careful quiet burning away in a single breath. There's nothing in there worth dying for. Wrong. The voice that answered wasn't the man behind the cellar wall. It came from further off, calm, almost conversational, carrying easily across the chaos in a way that told her exactly who was speaking, before she ever turned to look. There's everything in there worth dying for, Mrs. Ashfield, which is why we're not leaving without it. Ezra Cole, standing 30 yards off, in the open, rifle slung easy across his back like the gunfire around them, was nothing more than weather he'd learned to ignore a long time ago. You know what's in that chest, she called back, keeping her rifle up, keeping her voice level, even though her pulse was hammering hard enough to feel in her throat. Which means you know exactly how deep this goes. Which means you're smart enough to understand that killing me tonight doesn't make any of it disappear. Maybe not. Cole's voice stayed calm, almost pleasant, the voice of a man entirely comfortable with violence as a simple tool rather than a passion. But it buys time. And time's worth quite a lot to the men I work for. Vance. The name landed in the cold air between them like a struck match. For just a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, and she would have missed it if she hadn't spent 15 years learning to read exactly this kind of small, involuntary flicker. Something shifted behind Cole's composure. Surprise. Quickly buried. But real. He hadn't expected her to know the name. I don't know who you're talking about, he said, and his voice had gone a half shade too careful to be believed. You do. She held her position, held her aim, held everything steady even as the two men she'd already fired on began, slow and careful, to regroup somewhere behind the cellar wall. And so do I. Which means this ends tonight. One of two ways, Mr. Cole. Either you and your men ride off this mountain right now, or every one of you gets to explain to a federal judge exactly why you were willing to die protecting a senator's mining claim. Silence, long enough that she began to wonder if she'd overplayed the only card she had. Then Cole's voice came back, quieter now, and something in it had changed, not fear exactly, but recalculation, the sound of a man doing fast arithmetic he hadn't expected to need to do tonight. You're better informed than we were told, he said. You were told wrong about a great many things. She kept the rifle steady, starting with how easy tonight was supposed to be. Another pause. Then, from somewhere behind him, a low whistle, a signal, she realized, and around the perimeter she could hear it answered. Other men beginning, slow and deliberate, to fall back toward what remained of the wagons. Cole held his ground a moment longer, studying her across 30 yards of frozen dark, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite name, not respect, not exactly, but something close enough to it that it unsettled her more than open hostility would have. This isn't finished, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't, but it's finished for tonight, he turned. Walked, unhurried, back toward his men, and within minutes, the wagons, the two still capable of rolling, were loaded and moving, retreating down the trail the same unhurried way they'd arrived, leaving the disabled ones behind along with whatever wounded pride Cole was carrying back to whoever he answered to. Cora stood in the frozen yard long after the sound of them had faded into the dark, rifle still raised, her whole body shaking now that there was finally nothing left to aim at. She lowered the rifle slow, looked at the cellar door. Still locked, still shut. The evidence was safe. But that wasn't what she was thinking about. Standing there in the gray beginning of dawn with her breath fogging thick in front of her face. They came for the evidence, not for me. Which means they believe I know more than I do. Which means somewhere between the ledger and the mine shaft, somebody decided I'd already put together the whole picture, Vance, the mining claim, everything. Except I haven't, not the whole picture. Not yet. Which means whatever's still missing. Whatever piece I haven't found matters enough to 12 armed men that they were willing to ride onto a defended homestead in the dark to stop me from finding it. She looked east, toward where the sky had just begun to lighten behind the ridge, gold bleeding slow into gray, and felt something settle into her chest that was neither fear nor triumph, but something colder and steadier than either. So there's more. There's always more. Because men like this, men with senators for patrons and federal land for a target, they don't build something this careful, this patient, around a secret that fits in one dying man's ledger. Which means I'm not finished finding it. Which means, God help whoever's still hiding, neither is he. She walked to the corral first whistler, stamping, wild-eyed but unhurt, and she pressed her forehead against his neck for one long moment, letting herself feel, just briefly, the fact that she was still alive to be standing here at all. Then she walked back to the cabin, sat at the small table in the thin gray light of almost dawn, and pulled the satchel out from under the floorboards, where it had waited through the whole fight, undiscovered, untouched. She spread everything out again. The ledger. The confession. Nathaniel's letter. And this time, reading it all with fresh eyes, exhausted and aching, and more certain than she'd ever been of anything in 5 long years. She understood exactly what came next. She needed federal help. Real help, not just a telegram sent and hoped for, but marshals riding up this mountain with warrants and authority, enough to match whatever protection a man like Vance had bought himself in Denver. She needed Marshal Reyes to answer, and answer soon, because the next visit from Ezra Cole's men wasn't going to end with a warning shot and a retreat. The next visit, she understood with a certainty that settled into her bones like the cold, was going to end with somebody dead. She intended it not to be her. She banked the fire, though. The fire barely needed banking with dawn already breaking gold across the peaks, and sat a long moment with her hand resting flat against the worn cover of Nathaniel's letter, feeling the shape of the promise she'd made him tighten around her chest, like something with a pulse of its own. Almost there, she said, quiet, to the empty cabin, to the man who wasn't in it and never would be again. I found the thread, Nathaniel. I just have to follow it all the way to the end now. Outside, the wind had gone still, and in that stillness, brief, fragile, the kind of quiet that only ever came right before something enormous, Cora Ashfield allowed herself, for just one moment, to close at her eyes and breathe. Because tomorrow, she understood, the real fight was going to start. Tonight had only been the warning shot. Marshal Caleb Reyes rode into the yard 3 days later with 4 deputies behind him, and a face that hadn't aged well since the last time Cora had seen it. Older, she thought. Grayer, but the eyes were the same, steady, watchful. The eyes of a man who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how much weight a single human face could carry before it broke. He dismounted slow, studied her a long moment before he said anything at all. Eleanor Kincaid. His voice carried something between disbelief and relief, weathered thin by years of not knowing whether the woman he was speaking to still existed anywhere outside of old stories. 5 years. I thought you were dead. I tried to be. She held his gaze. Didn't take. Something almost like a smile moved across his face, gone as fast as it arrived. Your telegram, he said. You weren't exaggerating. I never exaggerate, Ben. She turned toward the cabin. Come inside. I'll show you why. They spread it all across her table. The ledger, the confession, Nathaniel's unfinished letter, the mine shaft documents, Nora's sketch, the shipping manifests marked mining equipment, consigned to addresses that traced straight back to Kessler's holding company. Reyes went through it page by page, silent, his jaw tightening a fraction more, with every sheet he turned. Because that was the thing about evidence like this. It didn't announce itself all at once. It arrived in pieces, small and quiet, until suddenly a man found himself holding the entire shape of something enormous in his 2 hands and understanding, all at once, exactly how much blood had already been spilled to keep it hidden. 8 years, Reyes said finally, low. 8 years, and nobody in Denver ever flagged a single one of these shipments. Somebody made sure of that. He looked up. Vance. She nodded once. Reyes sat back, and something crossed his face that she hadn't expected to see there, not surprise. Recognition. The look of a man hearing a name he'd already been carrying somewhere in the back of his mind. Quiet, unspoken, waiting for a reason to say it out loud. You know the name, she said. I know the name. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, slow, buying himself a moment before he said the rest of it. Josiah Vance. State Senator, 3rd term. Sits on committees that oversee federal land use in this territory. A pause. Cora, I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand I'm not asking it lightly. Ask Santa Fe. His voice had gone careful, the raid, the boy. Her whole body went still, because that name, that memory, lived in a drawer. She kept locked tighter than any other, tighter even than the one holding Nathaniel's last words. And she hadn't expected, sitting at her own kitchen table with a stack of evidence spread out between them, to hear anyone say it out loud again. What about it, she said. Flat, careful. The intelligence that sent your team into that house. Reyes held her eyes, and she could see him choosing every word like it cost him something to say it. It came through a federal liaison. Young lawyer, working for the Territorial Land Office at the time. He fed us information that the family inside was harboring known outlaws, armed and dangerous. Cora's hands had gone cold on the table. They weren't outlaws, she said, very quiet. No. Reyes's voice had dropped further still. They were a family fighting a mineral rights claim, refusing to sell land the territory wanted for a railway spur that never got built because somebody wanted the ground underneath it more than they ever wanted the railway. The room seemed to tilt. Because I've spent 15 years believing that was my failure, she thought, and the thought came fast and jagged, tearing loose something she'd kept buried so long she'd forgotten it could still move. Because I told myself I read the situation wrong. Because I told myself a scared boy reached for a gun that wasn't even his father's, and I made a choice in half a second that I've paid for every single night since. Except if the intelligence was false from the start. Except if somebody built that raid on purpose, knowing exactly what would happen when armed marshals kicked in a door expecting outlaws and found a frightened family instead. Who fed you the intelligence? She said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Reyes met her eyes, and she watched him decide, in real time, whether to say the rest of it. His name at the time was J. Vance, he said. Junior counsel for the Territorial Land Office. 26 years old. Ambitious as hell. I never made the connection until I read your telegram 3 days ago and started pulling old files. Cora sat very still, because there it was. The thread she hadn't even known she'd been missing, us, running all the way back through 15 years, connecting a boy's death in a Santa Fe alley, to a husband's death on a mountain ridge, to a company buying up land through careful, quiet lawyers. The same man. The same patient, careful, ambitious man, at every single turn using her once, without her ever knowing it, to clear a family off ground he wanted, and using her husband's curiosity, 5 years ago, as a threat worth killing over. And now, 12 armed men and a mining survey and a federal land grab so large it required a state senator's protection to keep it hidden at all. He used me, she said, and the words came out flat, stunned, like she was hearing them for the first time even as she said them. 15 years ago, before I ever knew his name, he fed my department false intelligence, and I walked into that house believing I was protecting innocent people from armed criminals. And instead, she stopped, couldn't finish it. Reyes reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close. You didn't do anything wrong, Cora. His voice had gone gentle in a way she'd rarely heard from him. You made a decision in half a second with information you had every reason to trust. The wrong was built into that raid long before you ever walked through the door. That doesn't bring the boy back. No, Reyes agreed, quiet. It doesn't, but it means the guilt you've been carrying for 15 years belongs somewhere else. And I think sitting here, you already know where. She did, Vance. 15 years of a name she'd never known to blame. Sitting 100 feet under everything she'd built, her guilt on top of the badge she'd turned in, the marriage she'd built to try to outrun it, the mountain she'd bought, hoping the quiet might finally let her put it down. And now he's killed Nathaniel too. Which means it isn't only Nathaniel's death I'm finishing this for anymore. Which means it never was only that. Which means some part of me has been chasing this man for 15 years without ever knowing his name, and now I finally have it, and God help me, God help all of us, I am not putting this down again until it's finished. She stood, slow, and walked to the window, looking out at the mountain going gold under the late afternoon light. How do we take him? She said, not turning around. They spent the next 2 days planning. The cabin transformed into something between a war room and a courtroom, maps spread across every surface, timelines pinned to the wall. Reyes's 4 deputies moving in and out with the quiet efficiency of men who'd done this kind of work before and understood exactly how much depended on getting it right. Reyes's plan was simple in its shape, complicated in its execution. A coordinated strike. Federal deputies would hit Kessler's processing station and arrest everyone on site, guides, enforcers, whatever clients happened to be present. Simultaneously, agents already stationed in Denver would move on Kessler's office, seize his records, freeze his accounts, and if the evidence Cora had gathered held up under a judge's eye, secure a warrant broad enough to reach the man standing behind him. Timing's everything, Reyes said, tracing a finger across the map. Both raids need to land within the same hour. Otherwise, word travels faster than we can. And Kessler scatters his operation before we ever get close enough to touch it. And Vance, Cora said. Vance is careful. Reyes's jaw tightened. 15 years careful. We're not going to walk into his office and slap irons on him with what we've got today. We need Kessler talking. We need the shipping manifests tied directly to a name that lands on him, not just his company. We need it airtight, Cora, because a man with 3 terms in the state Senate has more lawyers than we have deputies. So we take Kessler first. We take Kessler first, Reyes agreed, and we make him understand fast that the only way out of a federal prison cell is talking loud enough and clear enough that Vance can't buy his way out of what comes next. Cora looked at the map a long moment. At the small red circle marking the processing station, the road running east towards Cinder Hollow, the longer line stretching all the way to Denver, where somewhere behind a desk in an office, she'd never seen a man who'd used her once without her knowledge, was about to discover exactly how badly he'd underestimated the woman he'd used a second time. When? She said. 4 days. Reyes rolled the map closed. Enough time to get word to Denver and coordinate the second raid without giving Kessler's people a chance to notice anything's changed. 4 days. She could survive 4 days. She'd survived worse waits than that. What she wasn't prepared for, what none of them, sitting around that table, with maps and timelines and careful confidence, could have prepared for, was the 5th member of Reyes's team, standing quiet by the door through most of the planning, young and eager and saying almost nothing at all. Deputy Ridley, 24 years old maybe, new to the badge, eager in the particular way young men were eager when they'd joined a cause bigger than themselves and hadn't yet learned how much the world could ask of that eagerness, or broke something inside them. He watched the planning with careful attention, asked a few questions, quiet, competent, nodded along with Reyes's instructions like a man determined to prove himself worthy of the assignment. Cora barely noticed him at all, which later, she would understand, had been exactly the point. The 4 days passed slow, then all at once, the way waiting always did, nothing happening, and then suddenly everything happening within the same single terrible hour. She spent the time preparing the way she'd learned to prepare for anything that mattered. Rifle cleaned and cleaned again. Ammunition counted. The satchel of evidence copied, twice. One set kept locked in the cellar. One set carried on her own person at all times. Because trust, she'd learned this lesson, 15 years too late, and 5 years too late, all over again. Trust was a thing you extended carefully, and never completely, no matter how many badges stood in the room with you. She rode into Cinder Hollow once, on the 3rd day, to check on Nora, and found the young naturalist exactly where she'd left her, restless, eager, itching to be doing something more useful than waiting in a boarding house room. They're really doing it, Nora said, when Cora told her the timeline. The raid. It's actually happening. 4 days. And after? Nora's eyes searched her face. After it's over, what happens to the land? To the elk? 2 after it's over, Cora said. I'm going to make sure nobody ever touches this mountain again. Nora studied her a long moment. You believe that, she said. Not a question. A quiet kind of wonder. I have to. Cora's voice came out steadier than the feeling underneath it. Because if I don't believe it, none of the last 5 years mean anything at all. On the 4th night, the night before the raid, Cora couldn't sleep. She sat at the small table, the lamp burning low, and pulled out Nathaniel's journal, the one she'd read 100 times, every page nearly memorized, and found herself reading it again anyway, because some nights the only comfort left in the world was a dead man's handwriting. Marcus says he'll help. She stopped, blinked, read the line again. Marcus. The name meant nothing at first, one more entry among dozens, one more name in a journal full of them. Except she'd read this journal 100 times, and never once let the words settle the way it settled now, sitting alone at 4 a.m. with a raid 12 hours away, and every nerve in her body stretched thin as wire. Marcus says he's heard similar reports from other areas. We're going to coordinate an investigation. She sat very still. Because Nathaniel never named Walter in this journal. Not once. Because I read this 100 times and assumed because Walter was his partner, because Walter was the man who found his body, I assumed every unnamed ally in these pages was him. Except this entry uses a name, Marcus, which means somebody else was helping Nathaniel too. Somebody I've never once considered, somebody whose name I don't recognize at all. She flipped forward, fast now, scanning every page for the name again, and found it twice more, always brief, always careful. The entries of a man who trusted this person enough to bring them into an investigation that eventually cost him his life, but not enough to write down anything more specific than a first name. Marcus identified the owner. Denver businessman, railroad connections. Kessler. That much matched what she already knew. But who was Marcus? She sat with the question a long time, the lamp burning lower, her mind turning it over the way it turned over everything now, carefully, patiently, the way 3 ravens had taught her to read a trail nobody else could see. And somewhere near dawn, exhausted, her eyes burning from hours of careful reading, a thought arrived that she couldn't shake loose, no matter how hard she tried to dismiss it. What if Marcus was federal? What if Marcus was somebody inside the very system Nathaniel trusted to help him, somebody who took what he learned and passed it, quiet, careful, up a chain that eventually reached the exact man he was trying to expose? Which would explain how Kessler always seemed to know exactly when Nathaniel was getting close. Which would mean there's still somebody inside the system I'm about to trust with everything I've spent 5 years building toward. She didn't sleep at all that night. Reyes's team assembled at the cabin 2 hours before dawn. 12 men total, counting the deputies and the ranch hands from 3 neighboring properties who'd volunteered once word finally, quietly, spread about what had really been happening on the mountain. Good men. Angry men. The kind of men who'd spent months hearing gunfire echo off the peaks at odd hours and told themselves it was nothing, and now understood exactly how much it hadn't been nothing at all. They moved out in the dark, no lanterns, just starlight and the thin gray beginning of morning bleeding slow along the eastern ridge. Cora rode near the front, beside Reyes, the satchel of evidence strapped tight against her body, her rifle across her back, the way it had ridden 100 times before this morning, and would ride 100 times after, except this time, every few minutes, her eyes found Deputy Ridley riding a few lengths back, and something in her chest wouldn't settle, no matter how hard she tried to talk herself out of the feeling. Because I don't have proof. Because a first name in a 5-year-old journal isn't evidence of anything at all. Because I've spent so long being right about danger that some part of me can't stop looking for it even when it isn't there. Except the feeling won't leave. Except every time Ridley asks a question, where exactly is the processing frame? How many men usually guard the hidden road? What time does the second watering hole see traffic? Some old, cold instinct in my chest tightens another notch. Because those are good questions. Because those are exactly the questions a careful federal deputy should be asking before a raid. And because those are exactly the questions a man feeding information somewhere else would need answered too. She said nothing. Not yet. Because accusing a federal deputy on nothing but a bad feeling and a name in a journal was the kind of mistake that could unravel everything they'd built toward this morning. And she'd learned a long time ago that certainty mattered as much as instinct, especially when the cost of being wrong ran this high. But she watched him, careful, constant, and some part of her old patient, never quite as retired as she liked to pretend, began quietly to prepare for the possibility that this raid wasn't going to go the way Reyes's careful promised it would. They reached the processing station just as the sky began to lighten, gold bleeding slow across the eastern peaks, and took up positions exactly as Reyes had mapped them. Deputies and volunteers spread wide around the clearing, hidden in the tree line, waiting. At 6 o'clock the wagons arrived. Right on schedule. Kessler's hunting party. 8 men, 4 clients in fine city clothes, soft hands, the particular arrogance of wealthy men who'd never once had to consider that the world might not bend around their comfort. 4 guides, armed, watchful, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this 100 times and expected to do it 100 more. They dismounted, gathered around the processing frame, relaxed, easy, entirely unaware. Reyes waited until the last of them had climbed down, until the whole party stood loose and unguarded in the clearing. Then he stood. United States Marshal. His voice cracked across the clearing like a rifle shot of its own. Put down your weapons. You're all under arrest. Chaos, instant and total. Men scrambling for rifles, shouting, and Reyes's deputies were already moving fast, coordinated, the practiced choreography of men who'd trained for exactly this moment. Within minutes, the clients had surrendered outright, pale-faced, hands raised, the sudden appearance of federal badges apparently enough to strip every ounce of confidence from men who'd never faced real consequence for anything in their lives. The guides put up more of a fight. One reached for his rifle, and a deputy's boot sent it spinning into the dirt before he'd cleared it halfway from his shoulder. Another bolted for the trees and made it 20 yards before Cora stepped from cover, rifle leveled, and he froze at the sight of her face like he'd recognized in some old animal way exactly what he was looking at. Within 15 minutes, 8 men sat cuffed in the dirt, surrounded by armed deputies. But Kessler wasn't among them. Reyes crouched in front of the lead guide, a hard-faced man who matched every description they'd gathered of Ezra Cole, and studied him a long moment. "Where's Kessler?" Silence. "You're looking at 20 years. Minimum," Reyes said, quiet level. "Conspiracy. Wildlife trafficking. Attempted murder of a federal informant. That's if you cooperate. If you don't." Cole's jaw worked, weighing something. And then, low, reluctant, the words of a man who'd finally done the arithmetic and didn't like the number he'd landed on, Silver Ridge. A pause. "Grand Hotel. He's waiting on word the woman's dead." Something dark moved behind his eyes. When he said it, not quite regret, but close enough to it that Cora, watching, understood exactly how close last week's raid on her cabin had come to succeeding, and exactly how much this man in the dirt in front of her had been prepared to let it succeed. "He's about to be disappointed," Reyes said, standing. He turned toward his deputies. "Secure the prisoners. Transport to Cinder Hollow. Hold them at the jail until we're ready to move them to Denver." His eyes found Cora's. "I'm going after Kessler. I'm coming with you." Reyes studied her a moment, and something in his face said he'd expected exactly this, and had already decided, somewhere in the last 4 days, that arguing about it would be a waste of breath neither of them had time for. "You follow my lead," he said. "This is a legal arrest. By the book." "Understood." He looked past her, toward the deputies already moving prisoners, toward the wagons, and his gaze settled a moment on Deputy Ridley, standing near the edge of the clearing, watching the proceedings with an expression that looked, on the surface, exactly like every other young deputy's face on his first major raid. "Ridley," Reyes called. "Stay with the prisoner transport. Make sure nothing goes wrong on the road." "Yes, sir." Cora watched him go, and the cold feeling in her chest didn't loosen at all. Because that puts him alone with 8 prisoners and a road 12 miles long. Because if I'm wrong about him, that's fine. Nothing happens. The prisoners reach Cinder Hollow exactly the way they're supposed to. And because if I'm right, she didn't finish the thought. Couldn't afford to. Not with Reyes already mounting up, already turning them towards Cinder Hollow and whatever waited at the Grand Hotel. She mounted Whistler and followed, and told herself, over and over, the whole ride down, that she was wrong. She was not wrong. The Grand Hotel's lobby was empty, except for the same nervous young clerk Cora had spoken to days before, and his face went bloodless the moment federal marshals walked through the door. "Kessler," Reyes said. "What room?" He checked out, sir, an hour ago." Cora's stomach dropped. "Where did he go?" "The stage depot." The clerk's hand shook against the desk. "He's on the morning coach to Denver." They ran 2 blocks, through streets already waking, people scrambling out of the way of federal marshals, sprinting past with rifles in hand, and Cora's lungs burned cold with every breath by the time they reached the depot and saw the coach already pulling out, wheels grinding slow against packed dirt. "Stop." Reyes's voice tore across the street. "Federal marshal." The driver hauled the horses to a stop. The coach door opened. Edmund Kessler stepped down, composed, unhurried, dressed like a man attending a business meeting rather than fleeing an arrest warrant. He looked at Reyes. at Cora. And something in his face, calm, almost amused, told her instantly that whatever fear she'd expected to find waiting in this man simply wasn't there. Marshal Reyes. His eyes moved to her. Mrs. Ashfield. This is quite the reception. Edmund Kessler. You're under arrest. Reyes's hand rested on his revolver. Wildlife trafficking, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, corruption of federal officials. Shall I go on? Murder. Kessler's eyebrow lifted, unbothered. That's a serious accusation. Nathaniel Ashfield. Cora's voice came out flat, cold, carrying every year of the last 5 inside it. My husband. Killed 5 years ago because he found out what you were really doing on this mountain. I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. Amos Fielding's ledger says otherwise. She stepped closer, close enough that only the 3 of them could hear what came next. Your own men will testify against you the moment they understand. It's the only thing standing between them and 20 years in a federal prison. And I've read your shipping manifests, Mr. Kessler. Mining equipment. Consigned to your holding company. On federal land you had no right to survey. For the first time, something shifted in Kessler's composure, small, quick, gone almost before it arrived, but real. You have nothing that will stand up in court, he said, and his voice had gone a half shade too careful. We have everything. Reyes pulled out handcuffs. Turn around. Kessler's eyes flicked, just once, toward Cora. You should have taken the 50,000, he said, quiet, almost gentle, like a man offering a piece of advice rather than a threat. You could have walked away with your life exactly as comfortable as you wanted it. My husband was worth more than your entire fortune. Her voice didn't shake. And this mountain is worth more than every dollar you've ever made poisoning it. You think this ends with me? The words landed strange. Too calm, too certain. Coming from a man about to be walked in irons through the middle of a town that had spent months whispering his name in fear. I think it ends exactly where the evidence takes it, Reyes said, closing the cuffs around his wrists. Kessler's composure finally cracked, not into fear, exactly, but into something colder, something that looked almost like relief, the expression of a man who'd been carrying a weight for longer than he wanted and had just quietly decided to set at least part of it down. Then it doesn't end here, he said, low, meeting Cora's eyes one last time as the deputies led him toward the waiting wagon. It doesn't end with me at all, Mrs. Ashfield. I'm not the one you should have been hunting. Who then? Kessler almost smiled. It was not a pleasant thing to watch. Ask the man who wired me $50,000 to make your problem disappear, he said. Why, he's never once, in 8 years, let his own name appear on a single document I've signed. They locked Kessler in the Cinder Hollow jail alongside the 8 men from the processing station, and Reyes sent riders fast toward Denver, carrying word that the local half of the operation had fallen, the shipment records, the ledger, the mine shaft documents, everything now formally in federal custody. Everything, finally, ready to be laid in front of a judge who could reach as high as the evidence demanded. But something in Kessler's parting words just wouldn't leave Cora alone. Sittings in the small marshal's office that evening while Reyes worked through statements from the captured guides, one by one. Ask the man who's never once let his own name appear on a single document. Careful, patient. 15 years careful if she was right about who they were really chasing. She was standing at the window, watching dusk settle gold and slow over the mountains, when the door burst open behind her and a young deputy, not Ridley, one of Reyes's other men, breathless from a hard ride, stumbled in with blood soaking through the shoulder of his coat. Marshal, his voice came out ragged. The transport. The prisoners. Somebody hit us on the road. Reyes was on his feet instantly. Ridley. Gone. The deputy pressed a hand against his wound, face gone gray. He wasn't with us when the shooting started, sir. He'd already fallen back, said his horse had thrown a shoe. By the time the ambush hit, he wasn't anywhere in sight. Cora's whole body went cold and still. Because I knew. Because I felt it the whole ride out, and I said nothing. Because I didn't have proof. Because accusing a federal deputy on instinct alone felt like exactly the kind of mistake that could unravel everything. And now a deputy's bleeding on the floor and 8 prisoners are the prisoners, she said. Are they? 3 dead. The young deputy's voice cracked. Cole and 2 others got free in the confusion. The rest are still in custody, but, he swallowed hard. They knew exactly where to hit us, Marshal. Exactly when. Somebody told them our route. Reyes's face had gone hard as granite. Ridley, he said again. Quiet, now the anger banked down into something colder and more dangerous than shouting. I should have said something. Cora's voice came out tight, furious at herself, mostly for the hours she'd spent second-guessing an instinct that had been right the entire time. I found his name in Nathaniel's journal. Weeks ago. A federal contact who knew too much, too early, every single time. I told myself it wasn't enough to act on. It's never enough until it is. Reyes's jaw tightened. We don't have time to relitigate what either of us should have caught sooner. Ridley's in the wind, Cole's in the wind, and every hour we spend standing here arguing about blame is an hour Vance uses to bury whatever's left connecting him to any of this. He was right. She knew he was right. Which means the plan Reyes built 4 days ago is already broken. Which means whatever comes next, we're building it without the careful coordination we thought we had. Which means somewhere in Denver, right now, a man with 3 terms in the state Senate already knows his local operation collapsed this morning, and is already deciding exactly how fast and how completely to make every trace of himself disappear. How far to Denver, she said. 2 days hard riding. Reyes was already moving, already pulling maps back out, already reorganizing a plan that had needed reorganizing an hour ago and hadn't had the luxury of time to do it properly. Less if we push the horses harder than we should. Then we push them harder than we should. They rode out within the hour Cora, Reyes, and the 3 deputies still fit to ride, leaving the wounded man in Cinder Hollow's care, and Kessler locked tight behind bars with instructions that nobody, under any circumstance, was to be left alone with him. The 2 days that followed blurred together in a way Cora would only half remember afterward. Long hours in the saddle, short, brutal stretches of sleep snatched wherever the horses could rest, the cold, clean burn of mountain air giving way, slowly, to the flatter, dustier air of the territory beyond. She thought, riding, about everything that had brought her here. 15 years since Santa Fe. 5 years since the Ridge. Weeks since a widow knelt in frost beside cut wire and understood, without yet knowing why, that something enormous had crossed onto her land. And now the whole shape of it, laid bare. A man who used a scared young marshal once, 15 years ago, to clear a family off land he wanted. The same man, older, more careful, more powerful, who used a network of hunters and armed men to strip protected federal wilderness for whatever lay beneath it. The same man who had her husband killed the moment he got close enough to understand what was really happening. And I never even knew his name until 4 days ago. Which means 15 years of guilt I carried for a boy's death that was never truly my failure at all. Which means the drawer I've kept locked so tight, for so long I finally understand what was really inside it. Not my failure. His. She rode harder. They reached Denver on the evening of the 2nd day, exhausted, filthy, the horses lathered and stumbling, and went straight to the federal courthouse where Reyes's contacts had already, quietly, begun assembling everything they needed. The ledger, the shipping manifests, sworn statements from 3 of the captured guides who'd decided, faced with the reality of decades in a federal prison, that loyalty to Kessler wasn't worth the cost of their remaining years. A judge has agreed to review the evidence tonight, Reyes told her, voice hoarse with exhaustion. If it holds, if it's enough, we get a warrant broad enough to move on Vance directly. Search his offices. Freeze his accounts. Compel testimony. And if it isn't enough, Reyes met her eyes, and the honesty in his face was harder to hear than any lie would have been. Then a man with 15 years of careful distance between himself and every crime connected to this operation walks free, he said. And every ounce of evidence you've bled for gathering gets buried in a courtroom he has more influence over than we do. She sat in the courthouse hallway that night, the satchel resting against her knees, and watched the hours crawl past one at a time, while somewhere behind closed doors, a judge worked through pages that represented 5 years of a promise she'd made to a dying man on a mountain ridge. Near midnight, Reyes emerged. His face told her everything before he said a single word. We got it, he said. Warrant signed. We move at dawn. Josiah Vance's offices occupied the top floor of a building on Denver's Larimer Street, brick and glass, and carefully understated in exactly the way real power always dressed itself. And Cora stood across the street, at first light watching Reyes's deputies take up position around every exit. She thought about the man she was about to meet. 15 years since he fed false intelligence to a raid that ended with her bullet in a frightened boy's chest, and she'd never once known his name until 4 days ago. 5 years since he had her husband killed, and even now, walking toward this building, she still had no image of his face, nothing but a name. Careful and patient, sitting behind every terrible thing that had shaped the last decade and a half of her life. Careful, she reminded herself, climbing the courthouse steps beside Reyes. Because careful men don't crack the way frightened men crack. Because Kessler folded fast, once he understood the cost. This one's had 15 years of practice not folding at all. They moved through the lobby, past a receptionist, whose face went slack with confusion at the sight of federal badges, and up a narrow staircase toward the top floor. Reyes knocked once on the office door and didn't wait for an answer before opening it. The man behind the desk looked up, unhurried, the way a man looks up who has spent his whole career believing nothing could ever reach him inside his own walls. Josiah Vance was older than Cora had pictured, silver-haired, well-dressed, the kind of composed handsome that came from a lifetime of never once having to fight for anything with his own hands. He set down his pen, studied the badges, studied her, and something in his expression, when his eyes finally landed on Cora's face, shifted not fear, not exactly, but the particular unsettled recognition of a man realizing, all at once, that a piece of his past he'd believed permanently buried had just walked through his door carrying a warrant. Senator Vance. Reyes's voice was flat, formal, carrying the full weight of federal authority behind every syllable. You're under arrest. On what grounds? Vance's voice stayed calm, almost bored. Racketeering. Illegal survey and extraction on federally protected land. Conspiracy to commit murder. Reyes stepped forward. Shall I continue? I'd like to see the evidence connecting my name to any of that. Cora stepped forward before Reyes could answer. I already have it, she said. Every payment Edmund Kessler made, cross-referenced against your shell companies. My husband's investigation, 5 years old, that you had him killed to bury. And 15 years ago, before either of those things, a young territorial land office lawyer named J. Vance fed false intelligence to a federal marshal team that ended with a family destroyed and an innocent boy dead. Vance's composure held. Barely. You're speaking of things that happened a very long time ago, he said carefully. Things that were, at worst, unfortunate misreadings of intelligence available at the time. I was the marshal who pulled the trigger. Her voice didn't shake. I carried that guilt for 15 years, believing it was my failure alone. It wasn't. It was yours. And you built an entire career on the ground. You cleared using people like me, while men like Nathaniel Ashfield paid with their lives the moment they got close enough to see what you'd built. For the first time, something cracked behind Vance's calm, quick, controlled but real, a flicker of a much younger, hungrier man, showing through the careful surface of the one sitting behind this desk now. You have no idea what you're threatening to unravel, he said. Low. I have every idea. Cora set the satchel on his desk. 15 years of it. And by this afternoon, so will a federal judge. Reyes moved forward with the cuffs. Vance stood slow, composed even now, even with everything collapsing around him, and for just a moment meeting Cora's eyes across the desk. Something passed between them that felt less like defeat than like two people finally, after 15 years, seeing each other clearly for the first time. Your husband, Vance said quietly, as Reyes closed the cuffs around his wrists, was a very stubborn man. I want you to know I gave him every opportunity to walk away. He didn't know how to walk away from the truth. Her voice stayed steady, though something in her chest had gone tight and hot at the sound of his name in this man's mouth. Neither do I. They led him out through the lobby in full view of a dozen stunned employees, and Cora stood at the top of the staircase watching him go, feeling something in her chest finally, after 15 years, begin slowly, carefully to loosen. Not healed. Not yet. Maybe not ever, entirely, but loosened. The trials took months. Kessler, faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of his own men, pled to reduce charges in exchange for full cooperation that, in the end, provided exactly the documentation needed to tie every shell company, every shipment, every quiet payment, directly back to Vance's own hand. Walter Boyd testified too, voice shaking through every session, describing 8 years of complicity in a courtroom that showed him no more mercy than Cora had shown him in that hotel room. His sentence came in at 8 years reduced, in exchange for testimony, but real, and he would carry both the sentence and what remained of his conscience for whatever years came after it. Ezra Cole was never found. Neither was Deputy Ridley. 2 ghosts of their own now, scattered somewhere into a territory large enough to swallow men who knew how to disappear. Loose ends, Reyes told her, the day the last of it was finalized. We'll find them eventually. Men like that always surface again sooner or later. She believed him. Mostly. Josiah Vance received 25 years in federal prison racketeering, conspiracy, corruption of federal land use committees stretching back over a decade. Not murder, in the end. That charge hadn't survived the particular arithmetic of what a jury could be convinced of beyond doubt. But 25 years was 25 years, and Cora sat in the courtroom the day the sentence came down and felt, for the first time in 15 years, something close enough to peace that she almost didn't recognize the shape of it. She rode back to the mountain alone. In early spring, the trials finally behind her, the whole long weight of it finally, mostly, set down. The mountain looked different arriving this time. Not because it had changed the same peaks, the same valley, the same creek that never froze, but because she had. She rode up the trail with something in her chest that hadn't been there the first morning. The first morning she'd knelt beside cut wire in the frost. Something quieter, steadier, closer to the word home than anything she'd let herself feel in 5 long years. Nora was waiting for her at the cabin, having stayed through the whole ordeal, tending the small research station she'd begun building near the eastern watering hole, the same ground where 3 armed strangers had once stood over a processing frame, now marked instead with careful survey stakes and notebooks full of elk counts. 23 individuals, Nora said, when Cora dismounted. The herd's already growing back, faster than I expected. Cora looked out over the valley, green and quiet in the spring light, and felt something in her chest finally settle all the way down. It's going to keep growing, she said. I've made sure of that. She had. 2,000 acres, formally registered now as protected federal sanctuary, no hunting, no development, no human interference beyond careful scientific study. Nora's research station would grow into something permanent over the coming year. Funded properly, staffed properly. A place where what had nearly been destroyed could instead, slowly, be allowed to heal. Late that summer, on a warm evening with the sun sliding gold behind the western peaks, Cora climbed to the ridge one last time. She found the spot easily, the same rocks, the same long clean view down into the valley below, the place where she'd once knelt in her husband's blood and made a promise she hadn't understood the shape of for 5 long years. She'd had a small stone marker placed there that spring. Simple, unadorned. His marshal's badge, the one she'd found in the evidence box, mounted at its center. Nathaniel Ashfield. He protected what mattered. She knelt and placed fresh wildflowers against the stone purple columbine, the ones he'd always loved best, and let her fingers rest a long moment against the cool, weathered surface of the marker. It's done, she said, quiet, into the wind that moved soft and warm through the pines. Everything you fought for, everything you died protecting. It's safe now. The wind answered the way it always seemed to answer, moving gentle through the branches, and she let herself believe, just for a moment, that it was something more than only wind. I found the man who took you from me, she said. It took me 5 years, but I found him, and I made him answer for it for you, and for a boy I lost 15 years before I ever knew your name. She sat there a long while, watching the light shift gold and then rose and then deep amber across the peaks, feeling the particular ache of grief that had, somewhere over the last several months, finally begun to soften into something bearable. Not gone. Never entirely gone. But bearable, the way old wounds became bearable once a person finally stopped picking at them and let them close. "I'm staying," she said finally, standing, brushing dirt from her knees. "This is home now. Ours. I'm going to guard it as long as I have strength left to do it." She walked back down toward the cabin as dusk settled soft and warm over the mountain, and somewhere behind her, in the valley below, an elk called out across the quiet a sound that, 6 months earlier, would have carried nothing but memory and grief. Tonight it carried something else entirely. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, it sounded almost like peace. She stood on her porch that night, coffee cooling in her hands, watching the stars come out one by one over a mountain that no longer held only ghosts. Somewhere below, Nora's lamp burned steady in the small research station window. Somewhere further still, in a courtroom 200 miles away, a man who'd spent 15 years believing himself untouchable was learning, slow and hard, exactly what it cost to underestimate a woman he'd once used and never bothered to remember. And somewhere in the quiet space between all of it, between grief and justice, between the badge she'd once carried and the promise she'd finally kept, Cora Ashfield found, at last, something that had eluded her for 5 long years. Not an ending exactly. Grief didn't work that way, and she'd learned better than to expect it to. But a beginning, a mountain healing, a promise finally fully kept, and a woman who had spent so many years being called a ghost, standing very much alive under a wide open sky, exactly where she belonged.